You are listening to the Objects of Affection collection. Study 22, Hiroshi Fujiwara and the Architecture of Post-Luxury Influence. An architecture of intention, where scarcity becomes authority and the monogram becomes philosophy. Every era produces its architects of culture, figures whose work transcends the object and instead builds systems, codes, and structures of meaning. In the 19th century, luxury houses constructed dynasties whose monograms became secular sacraments of permanence. In the 20th century, designers built empires whose names became synonymous with spectacle. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a new paradigm emerged, influence not as empire but as architecture, not as spectacle but as sanction. At the center of this paradigm stands Hiroshi Fujiwara. To describe him merely as a designer, DJ, or tastemaker is to diminish the structural significance of his role. Fujiwara is not an executor of trends but their architect. He is a figure who demonstrates that influence can be constructed discreetly, sustained invisibly, and expanded intentionally. His fragment design lightning bolt is not a logo in the conventional sense. It is a creative thumbprint, a monogram of philosophy, an imprint of intentionality. This study, Hiroshi Fujiwara and the Architecture of Post-Luxury Influence, seeks to analyze Fujiwara not as an individual designer, but as a cultural architect whose work exemplifies the condition of post-luxury conceptual functional art. We will explore how his career reframed Harajuku as a counterpoint to old-world luxury, how his philosophy dissolved the boundaries between art, design, and life, how his logo functions as a monogram of resonance, how his collaborations expanded his architecture across global industries, and how his intentionality produced a legacy capable of enduring without empire. The central argument is clear. Fujiwara has revealed a new blueprint for influence. His career proves that the most powerful cultural force of our age is not inheritance but intentionality, not spectacle but discretion, not permanence of object but permanence of meaning. The unseen force of modern culture, Hiroshi Fujiwara, is often introduced through superlatives. The godfather of streetwear, the living internet, the first true Japanese DJ of hip-hop. Each of these labels is true, yet each is insufficient. They describe events, not essence. To understand Fujiwara is to understand not what he produced, but what he architected. His real work is not a shoe, a shirt, or a collaboration. It is the system of influence within which those artifacts became resonant. He is, above all, an architect of the unseen. Unlike designers who construct empires around their names, Fujiwara resists spectacle. He operates in deliberate obscurity, yet it is precisely this discretion that magnifies his cultural authority. His influence is measured not by his visibility, but by his imprint, a mark that recurs across generations of brands, collaborations, and movements. The paradox of Fujiwara's career is that of discrete omnipresence. He is everywhere and yet almost nowhere. His role is to engineer conditions under which others thrive, to sanction objects with a lightning bolt, to mentor disciples who will themselves become architects. He is less a sovereign than a code, less a monarch than a matrix. Influence without empire. Traditional designers often equate influence with empire. Giorgio Armani built a global labyrinth of boutiques. Karl Lagerfeld transformed Chanel into a perpetual spectacle of logos and runways. Even Rei Kawakubo, iconoclast though she was, constructed a monumental presence through Comme des Garçons' relentless expansion. Influence in these models is tethered to scale. The more visible, the more powerful. Fujiwara inverted this equation. His company, Fragment Design, employs only a handful of people. Its output is intentionally narrow, sporadic, and elusive. Rather than expansion, Fujiwara chose contraction. Rather than visibility, he chose opacity. And yet his cultural authority radiates across the globe. He has shaped Nike's sneaker strategy, Louis Vuitton's embrace of streetwear, and the global template for collaboration as a business model. This is influence without empire. It is the architecture of smallness, where scale is not achieved through corporate growth but through philosophical dissemination. Fujiwara's influence does not depend on owning factories, stores, or even archives. It depends on the intentionality of the stamp, the recognition that if an object bears his sanction, it enters a higher order of cultural resonance. The architecture of discrete authority. Every architect builds with constraints. Fujiwara's chosen constraint is discretion. His fragment design logo, the double lightning bolt, is not emblazoned across billboards, nor is it turned into wallpaper on handbags. It appears small, almost hidden, sometimes only visible to those who know where to look. It functions not as advertisement but as affirmation, a subtle signal that the object has passed through Fujiwara's filter of taste. This is an architecture of discrete authority. Authority in this model is not broadcast, it is conferred, it is less proclamation than benediction. The consumer does not wear a lightning bolt to announce status to the world, they wear it to recognize themselves within a code. This is the inversion of the luxury logo. Where the Louis Vuitton monogram screams inheritance, the Fragment bolt whispers initiation. Discreet authority is also Fujiwara's personal mode of operation. He appears in interviews reluctantly, avoids spectacle and shrinks from the machinery of fashion weeks. His power is cumulative rather than performative. Each collaboration, each discreet sanction builds upon the last, creating a long arc of consistency that defines his legacy. The invisible network. To understand Fujiwara's cultural architecture, one must trace the invisible network he constructed. His mentorship of Nigo led to a bathing ape, which would globalize Japanese streetwear. His support of Jun Takahashi nurtured Undercover, which became a lodestar of experimental fashion. His collaborations with Nike redefined the sneaker as a cultural artifact, not just athletic gear. His partnership with Louis Vuitton sanctioned streetwear within the highest echelon of luxury. This is not coincidence, it is structure. Fujiwara operates as a node of connectivity, a nexus through which ideas pass, mutate, and proliferate. Like the internet, he does not dictate content but enables circulation. His genius is in creating ecosystems rather than empires, networks rather than monuments. He is not the castle but the bridge. Here we glimpse the radical difference between Fujiwara and the traditional designer. The old model builds vertically, empire, mason, dynasty. Fujiwara builds horizontally, network, collaboration, ecosystem. Vertical power requires control, horizontal power requires connection. Fujiwara's architecture is the latter, an invisible scaffolding that supports others while remaining understated itself. Philosophy as practice. Fujiwara insists he is not a designer but a creative. This statement, often misunderstood as modesty, is in fact precise. Design in the conventional sense produces objects. Creativity, as Fujiwara defines it, produces conditions. His work is conceptual functional art. Conceptual because the idea, the sanction, the code, the aesthetic gesture, matters more than the physical object. Functional because these ideas embed themselves into the objects of everyday life. A Fragment sneaker is not just footwear, it is a philosophical statement about scarcity, authority, and discretion. A Fragment collaboration with Starbucks is not about coffee, it is about embedding taste into the most banal of commodities, transforming them into carriers of cultural meaning. In this way, Fujiwara dissolves the old distinction between art and life, between philosophy and commerce. Every collaboration becomes a philosophical act, every product a structural beam in his architecture of being. The logic of permanence through transience. Fujiwara's influence appears paradoxical. How can someone so discreet, so resistant to permanence, sustain such lasting authority? The answer lies in his embrace of permanence through transience. Each drop, each limited edition, each fleeting collaboration is designed to vanish. Yet it is precisely this transience that creates permanence in cultural memory. Scarcity begets myth, absence begets aura. This recalls Walter Benjamin's notion of the aura of the artwork, its uniqueness, its unrepeatability, its distance. Old-world luxury once offered aura through craft and heritage. Fujiwara generates aura through transience, through the deliberate refusal of scale. His lightning bolt carries aura not because it is everywhere, but because it is rare, discreet, and sanctioned. Fujiwara as cultural architect. To call Fujiwara a cultural architect is not metaphorical but structural. He does not build buildings but he builds systems. He does not draft blueprints of stone but he drafts codes of meaning. His architecture is invisible but no less load-bearing. Like the hidden beams that hold up a cathedral, his influence sustains entire industries of streetwear, luxury, and collaborative culture. Architecture is not only about form, it is about intention. Fujiwara's career is defined by intentionality. He chose discretion over spectacle, smallness over empire, networks over monuments. Each choice was structural, each decision reinforcing the architecture of discrete authority. The prototype of post-luxury. Fujiwara embodies the prototype of post-luxury conceptual functional art. In this paradigm, value is not inherited but earned, not broadcast but whispered, not mass-produced but intentionally scarce. His Fragment design monogram functions not as ornament but as imprint, not as decoration but as sanction. He is the unseen force of modern culture, a figure who proves that true influence requires no empire, no monument, no spectacle. It requires only architecture, of ideas, of networks, of intention. Fujiwara has built such an architecture, and in doing so he has reshaped the very conditions under which culture assigns value. The architecture of cultural authority. Luxury, as we have inherited it, has always been a matter of inheritance. From the salons of Paris to the ateliers of Florence, value has been defined by lineage, by masons whose monograms were less decoration than dynastic heraldry. To wear Hermes or Louis Vuitton was not merely to own an object but to participate in a genealogy, to extend oneself through the permanence of a house that promised to outlive its wearer. But in the late 20th century, this model began to fracture. Scale eroded sanctity, repetition hollowed out ritual, and the monogram became a tired echo of itself. Luxury, once anchored in intention, collapsed into reflex. What was once sacred became mere habit of consumption. It was within this vacuum that Hiroshi Fujiwara emerged, not as a designer in the traditional sense, but as a cultural architect, orchestrating from Tokyo's Harajuku a new grammar of value. His imprint, Fragment design, and the discrete thunderbolt monogram that accompanies it operate not as a brand in the conventional sense but as a creative thumbprint. A stamp of sanction, a mark of curated authority. Fujiwara's work cannot be reduced to fashion. It must be understood as post-luxury conceptual functional art. In this paradigm, objects derive their resonance not from material worth or aristocratic lineage, but from intentional scarcity, cultural connectivity, and philosophical weight. The lightning bolt is less a logo than a seal of approval. His collaborations are less products than structural beams in a wider architecture of influence. This study argues that Hiroshi Fujiwara is not merely a participant in culture, but a constructor of it, an architect who reframed the very possibility of value. His career must be read as a long-form manifesto, a deliberate act of engineering influence. To trace Fujiwara's trajectory is to study the monogram as cultural imprint, not as ornament but as structure, not as inheritance but as authorship. The genesis of a counterpoint, Tokyo's Harajuku scene. To understand Hiroshi Fujiwara's ascendancy as a cultural architect, one must begin not with his later collaborations or global recognition, but with the urban crucible that forged his sensibility. Tokyo's Harajuku in the 1980s and 1990s. Harajuku was not simply a geographic district. It was an architectural condition, a street-level academy where rebellion, curiosity, and cultural importation were rehearsed into a new grammar of value. If Paris in the 19th century was the birthplace of haute couture, then Harajuku in the late 20th century was the site of its deliberate dismantling, a stage on which Fujiwara orchestrated a counter-philosophy to the hollow monuments of old-world luxury. Harajuku as anti-Paris in the 1980s. Japan's economic bubble had cultivated an insatiable appetite for European luxury. The monogrammed bags of Louis Vuitton, the gilt interlocking CS of Chanel, the rigorous codes of Hermes, all were not merely consumer goods, but tokens of participation in a global aristocracy of appearances. Luxury in its European incarnation was a code of inherited status. One bought not only the bag, but the imagined membership in a lineage of nobility, of salons, of masons whose very architecture announced permanence. Harajuku was the inversion of this. It was, in its original form, an illicit street laboratory. Youth gathered not around monuments of stone but asphalt intersections, storefronts, and record shops. Harajuku was ephemeral, shifting, unstable, a built environment in which impermanence itself became the condition of creativity. Against the static weight of Parisian luxury, Harajuku asserted fluidity. Where Europe offered inheritance, Harajuku insisted on invention. Fujiwara's genius lay in recognizing this condition and formalizing it into a philosophy. Harajuku was not to be consumed as a passing subcultural fad, it was to be architected into a system of influence. The pilgrimage of a cultural conduit born in eyes, a city of shrines and tradition, Fujiwara's flight to London and New York was not escapism, but initiation. The adolescent encounter with punk rock in London, Vivienne Westwood, Malcolm McLaren, offered him a first template for rebellion as style system. Punk was not merely clothing, it was philosophy materialized in leather, safety pins, and attitude. It announced that value could be created not by craft alone, but by ideology stitched into textile. New York, in contrast, revealed to him hip-hop, a seamless convergence of music, dance, fashion, and visual art into a unified life world. Hip-hop was not compartmentalized. It was an ecosystem of cultural production where sneakers, graffiti, and sound operated as equivalent registers of expression. This was architecture without architects, a community building its own codes from fragments. When Fujiwara returned to Tokyo, he did so not as a mere consumer of foreign subcultures, but as a cultural conduit. He was, in the oft-cited phrase, the living internet before connectivity became digital. By importing records, magazines, and clothing, he acted as a one-man hyperlink, embedding Tokyo youth within a global network of emerging cultural capital. Yet unlike the internet's later ubiquity, Fujiwara's network was intentionally scarce, curated, and deeply insider. Harajuku as the architecture of scarcity. At the height of Japan's luxury obsession, scarcity was not the commodity. Vuitton could be purchased, Chanel acquired, Hermes displayed, each at exorbitant price but non-inaccessible to the expanding Japanese middle and upper classes. In this environment, Fujiwara introduced a radically different model: exclusivity not through price, but through limitation and insider knowledge. His label Good Enough, launched in 1990, embodied this. The clothes were not mass-produced luxury goods with logos screaming recognition. They were stealth objects made in small runs, distributed through tightly controlled channels and understood only by those in the know. Ownership was not conspicuous but discreet. The true value lay not in displaying wealth but in signaling cultural literacy. This was not luxury as commodity, it was luxury as code. A good enough t-shirt was less a garment than a key unlocking access to an insider architecture of meaning. To wear one was to declare membership in a philosophy of scarcity and authenticity, not simply possession of money. Yura Harajuku, the subterranean blueprint from these experiments arose what came to be known as Yura Harajuku, literally, the back streets of Harajuku. This was not the glossy Omotesando boulevard of flagship stores, but the labyrinth behind it, a hidden infrastructure where authenticity was built brick by brick. Yura Harajuku was an inversion of the luxury mason. Where European brands built marble temples to permanence, Yura Harajuku operated from cramped basements, narrow alleys, and makeshift storefronts. Yet its influence radiated globally. Fujiwara, alongside proteges like Nigo and Jun Takahashi, transformed these spaces into cultural foundries. The Nowhere store funded by Fujiwara was not a boutique in the traditional sense, it was an institute of influence. From its shelves emerged a bathing ape and Undercover, brands that would themselves become global architects of style. Nowhere was both a retail site and a classroom. Its curriculum was rebellion, scarcity, and curated authenticity. Comparative framework: Old World Luxury vs. Harajuku philosophy. To frame Harajuku as a counterpoint to Old World luxury is not to diminish the craftsmanship of European houses, but to expose the hollowness that scale and repetition had inflicted upon them. Luxury had become formulaic, its codes ossified into predictable monograms and runway cycles. By contrast, Harajuku introduced what might be called earned authority, Old World luxury, value as inheritance encoded in lineage, monogram, and price. Harajuku philosophy, value as initiation, access through knowledge, scarcity, and cultural alignment. Where Vuitton promised permanence through its canvas, Fujiwara's Harajuku promised transience curated into meaning. Where Chanel offered elegance as repetition, Good Enough offered rebellion as a one-time event. Harajuku and the Japanese avant-garde. Fujiwara's rebellion cannot be separated from the earlier Japanese avant-garde. Comme des Garçons and Yohji Yamamoto had already destabilized Paris with their asymmetrical silhouettes and aesthetic of imperfection, but theirs was still a rebellion staged within haute couture. Fujiwara's stage was different: asphalt, alleys, and basements. His Harajuku was not Paris in opposition but Tokyo in invention. It refused validation by Paris entirely, crafting an alternate blueprint for value. The remainder of this study continues at objectsofaffectioncollection.com. This has been a study from the Objects of Affection Collection, a critical art research institution operating under the framework of Post-Luxury Conceptual Functional Art. Read the full research at objectsofaffectioncollection.com.